Hi, Jim Setzer with Images by Design, and today let's explore high-speed sync. So let's talk about the what, the when, the why, the how of high-speed sync, starting with a quick definition for those people that don't want to hang out for the rest of this video and all the technical stuff. In a nutshell, high-speed sync is an option in many speed lights and studio strobes that allow you to use flash photography in higher shutter speeds. Now your camera has what's called the X-Sync speed. It's the fastest shutter speed that it can deal with a standard flash. And you have to look at your camera's manual to find this number. It's going to be somewhere between 1/200th of a second. Higher end sports and wildlife cameras can go up to 1/350th of a second. For the most of us, it's going to be somewhere in the 1/250th of a second range. Anything below that, you can use any flash. If you want to use shutter speeds above that, you really have to have a flash that supports high-speed sync. Okay? So when would you want to use high-speed sync? Well, one example might be taking, let's say, portraiture outdoors. You've got a lot of light, and you want your subject to be properly exposed without completely blowing out the background. So maybe you want to get a little fill light on that subject. You also want to have a relatively large aperture to give a nice bokeh, to separate your subject from the background a little bit, which means a couple of things. One, you could put a big neutral density filter to block out a lot of that light on the front of your camera, but that makes shooting portraiture very hard. You can't see your subject's expressions. You can't get the autofocus to land perfectly on the eye like you want to in portraiture. So ND filters are problematic in this situation. The other thing you want to do then is shoot at a very high shutter speed so you get just the right amount of light in your exposure. So why do we need high-speed sync for these high shutter speed shots? Well, in order to understand that, you really have to understand a little bit first about how the shutter in your camera works. Most modern cameras have what's called a curtain-style shutter. It's a series of metal blades laid out in kind of a folds of a curtain sort of thing. And there's a front curtain that opens, kind of pulls away to expose your sensor or your film. And then there's another set of little metal blades that fold back over the top of your sensor or your film and completes the exposure. Here's a little GIF animation that kind of shows what happens there. You can see what's called the leading curtain, or the first curtain, begin to open to expose the sensor. Then, toward the end of the exposure, you have the second curtain come in and close behind it. That is any exposure below your X-Sync speed, that top speed we were talking about. Look it up in your manual. And somewhere in that exposure, usually right about the middle, is where your camera tells your flash to fire, because the flash pulse is so much quicker, many, many times faster than your shutter speed at this rate. But what happens when you crank your shutter speed up beyond this point? Well, now that rear curtain needs to begin to close before that first curtain is completely open. It's more of a partial exposure of your sensor at any time. And if you flash your standard flash, that really tightly light pulse, you're going to get banding. You're going to get dark areas at the top or the bottom or both in your exposure. It's going to be completely wrong. The higher the shutter speed, the harder this problem, because at the very highest shutter speeds, you can see that your sensor is only exposed in one small slit at any moment. High-speed sync is a much more complex way to fire that tube. It basically is firing thousands and thousands of little tiny pulses of light, not expending the entire tube at once, pulsing so that the light of the flash is on through the entire exposure. In fact, it's before and after, because it's got to kind of settle down. This next chart is going to show that high-speed sync operation in a graph. To begin with, the camera is going to tell your flash to begin to fire. It begins to ramp up and send thousands of little micro bursts of light instead of one single pulse. It does that all the way through the dance of the shutter exposure as those curtains open and close. Once that final curtain is completely closed, the flash can now shut down. Basically, it's turned your strobe into a continuous light for the entire length of the exposure. And that's how it works. So a couple of things to think about when deciding whether you want to buy a high-speed sync capable strobe or something maybe less expensive. Most of the time, it's not that expensive an option, $20, $50 more for the model that's going to support high-speed sync. Even though you say, well, I never use that, it would be a shame to buy a strobe or a family of strobes and then get into situations where you wish you had it. It really is not that much more expensive to go the high-speed sync route. Second thing you need to consider is, remember that continuous pulse of energy, that's going to be very wasteful. In other words, if you get, say, 300 shots out of your flash in below X sync regular shooting style, you're not going to get that in high-speed sync. It takes a lot more energy to generate that light, and it's not going to be nearly as intense. Full power in high-speed sync mode is not nearly as bright as full power in standard manual mode. So think about those, consider those. Keep that in mind when you're shooting. So when you have those situations and you need to crank up that shutter speed to be able to use that high-speed sync, you may not be able to do your simple exposure triangle calculations. You're probably gonna have to bump the power up, if you can, even more in your flash to compensate for that. I hope you guys found this video interesting and informative. If you did, please click the like button down below. And if you'd like to see more videos from this channel, hit subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I always check comments and I always try to respond. For Images by Design, I'm Jim Setzer. Have a great day.